Money moves the world, and banking moves money. Welcome to the Public Bank Solution, conversations about an emerging new American institution, publicly owned partnership banks able to rebalance the scales of monetary control in service of the public interest and our commonwealth. Brought to you by the Public Banking Institute and its National Association of Partners and Organizations. Hello and welcome to the Public Bank Solution. I'm Walt McCree, a senior advisor to the Public Banking Institute and co-director of the Banking Law New Jersey. Our program, the Public Bank Solution, discusses the realm of publicly owned financial institutions. So we talk about money in several different dimensions. And today, we have four guests today that we're very excited to be able to share with you about a certain aspect of our monetary ecosphere called philanthropy, known as philanthropy. Philanthropy, the love of humanity, is how that has been framed and passed down through the generations. But like so much of the rest of our monetary system, it has been perverted in some ways, in many ways, frankly, by the practice of wealthy owners and participants directing the outcomes in ways that perpetuate some of the inequities that we are primarily concerned with, of course, both as citizens and as economists, and how philanthropy needs to be reimagined. So our program we're calling Reimagining American Philanthropy. And we're going to be doing this conversation in two sections of two different episodes. So let me bring in our guests. We have with us today Mackinzee Macho, who is a Deputy Global Head of Practice and a Senior Program Manager at the Foresight Lab. With her, her boss, I suppose, or a partner, colleague, L.Quevedo, who is the Global Head of Practice at the Foresight Lab for Regenerative Design. Also, Patricia Blessman, who is a psychiatrist and also a child advocate in philanthropy, and Mark Watson, who is the president and co-founder of Potlikker Capital, doing some very exciting work with Black and Indigenous communities around capital investments and so forth. So let's begin by taking a look at what we see, how our guests are seeing the problems with philanthropy as we understand it and see it today, witness it today. And we'll start with Mackinzee Macho of the Foresight Lab. Mackinzee, how does philanthropy look to you? What's the problem here?
Yes, thank you. Well, as you said, the word philanthropy, coming from the Greek word philanthropia, simply meant love of mankind. But nowadays, it seems as though the word philanthropy and the definition of it had been skewed. We see billionaires and millionaires giving money out of the love for humanity, as they say, but in actuality, as studies have shown, giving money to others makes us feel better. So in a sense, we can see philanthropy as a form of narcissism, which is pretty aggressive to say. And obviously not every philanthropist and giver of money is a narcissist, but when we do something for others, it makes us feel good as well. And some of the earliest writing from Juan Luis Vive wrote in 1526, an essay in which he holds civil authorities responsible for poor relief to maintain societal order. And that's obviously just one of the earliest writings on philanthropy. So it's not a new gesture and has obviously been around for centuries. And it can be best defined as recognizing and supporting the humanity of others. But when we think about modern day philanthropy, those who practice it are tackling the very dislocations that they themselves have caused, such as economic, health, and educational disparities, just to name a few. And as I said, giving can make you feel better. And sometimes we think that giving money can cover up the bad things we have done. For example, Harvey Weinstein gave $5 million to the Film School University of Southern California toward a scholarship fund for female filmmakers, and he is now serving a 23-year sentence for rape and sexual assault. And there are quite a few philanthropists and philanthropies, giving organizations that sort of do the same thing as this. In 2019, institutions, public foundations, and ultra high net worth individuals, $30 million plus dollars, gave $428 billion to philanthropy globally. However, my question is, would we still see billions gifted if these tax cuts and donor advised funds were no longer allowed?
Uh, yes, well, interesting. 60 Minutes had a wonderful interview with Darren Walker, the head of the Ford Foundation, who was talking about generosity being more about the giver than about the mission. And I think what you point to, Mackinzee, is that it's become institutionalized as a way of providing some beneficent outcomes. But let's talk with Patricia Blessman, who is an advocate for children's rights as well as a philanthropist yourself, right, Patricia?
Yes. I'm a clinical psychologist with over 30 years of experience and training and in administering mental health programs. I'm my journey to this point has been an interesting one in the sense that given my beginnings, nobody would have thought that I would have gone on this trajectory. I started off in this world as an orphan, foster child, and now married to a man who's part of the 1%. So my entree into philanthropy has been through that route, and I've also had my own business where I made significant seven-figure sales. But I come out of philanthropy in a different, approaching it from a different perspective than most people do. In the sense that, um, I see that philanthropy can be a place of institution building. I understand what the freedom that generational wealth can provide, and it's a sort of freedom to be able to speak out and without worry about basic taking care of the lights and putting food on the table. To be able to, and I wish that in some levels, institutions that I see that are doing great work, that they had that kind of financial freedom as well. Um, I don't necessarily see philanthropy moving towards problem solving or institution building, or nor being very much data driven. Um, Nor can it focus on structural issues if we're tackling structural issues if we're talking about problems or issues that may take years, 5 to 10 years to resolve, because most funding cycles don't last that long. I'm not so sure that uh, philanthropy as it exists now, most of the time it supports the status quo as opposed to being a catalyst for paradigm shifts. Um, and then lastly, and I think what's really interesting is that except with the exception of maybe of Darren Walker more recently, rarely are the recipients of philanthropic initiatives in charge of actually directing or coming up with the solutions or the proposals on how to solve problems as part of the philanthropic
Yeah.
thrust.
Thank you, Patricia. A nice characterization of how the structure of philanthropy has been really not working so much for the outcomes, but really institutionally reinforced and really ossified through its practice. But when we talk about really creative, entrepreneurial, new approaches to how philanthropy could be done, our next guest, Mark Watson, the president and co-founder of Potlikker Capital, is doing some really remarkable work. Mark, tell us about what you're doing and how you're framing the concern.
Well, thank you for this opportunity. After 3 decades of working in finance, from public to corporate to impact investing, it really is giving me an interesting purview of the possibilities and the challenges around capital. And one of the takeaways I'd like to offer to your audience is to not divorce philanthropy from other types of capital. It's really a reductionist view to view capitalism in one box, and then on the side is sort of this grant resource.
Mm-hmm.
I also would argue that the grant resource has value. It has value to provide R&D capital. It is able to absorb risk that other types of capital does not. The issue here is around power and
Yes.
those grant resources. And
Yeah.
I would also argue that the fact that that the way philanthropy is distributed is provincial is not a new idea. I mean, from feudal systems, from land being given, there's always strings attached to it. So this is not a new paradigm. What we're offering today, hopefully, is to discuss ways that we can actually introduce a new paradigm where you are taking dollars that have received some sort of tax benefit from the public sector and leaving the power in the public commons, and not necessarily still tethering the direction of those dollars to private interests. That connection has not been broken, which is why we still see private interests being furthered through grant dollars. So I'm hoping that we can discuss today some ways that we can braid all sorts of capital together and move that within the governance structure of the common interest so that we actually can have systemic structural solutions, which is a challenge in the way things are distributed today.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mark. That really well describes what I suppose has been called philanthrocapitalism. Perhaps in part seen by Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller, all of those people who invested graciously and did provided their beneficence to the public at scraps on the table, basically. Only 2% on average for the last 40 years, only 2% of disposable income with wealthy families has been contributed to for philanthropic purposes. So our guests have so far laid out kind of the framework of where philanthropy is at. Where are we headed from here? Let's talk with, Ed. Regeneration is, of course, the theme that the Foresight Lab brings forward, and as what our guests are working on. Tell us how you're seeing this issue from that perspective.
Thanks, Walt. Thanks for having us and for asking a good question. I think we need to acknowledge the good works before we get on to what regenerative philanthropy might look like. The good works are worth celebrating. Our society's culture, the groundswell of the human spirit that innervates everything we do in life that really matters, not including most work, comes from philanthropy. Our museums, research and development, institutions of higher learning, schools. The philanthropic or donative gesture is, at its heart, a good one in the sense that it fuels our culture. And in the United States, since we don't have a Ministry of Culture, we're pretty confused about what culture is. But most civilized countries have a Ministry of Culture that holds the brief for cultivating culture. We don't, but that's part of a larger discussion. But setting aside the good works, we need to acknowledge that every single philanthropist that we revere, Rockefeller, Carnegie, Ford, were the Jeff Bezos of their day. And as much as we might feel that Jeff Bezos has given hundreds of thousands of people jobs, they are certainly not jobs of dignity and purpose. They are certainly not jobs that elevate the human spirit and stand for what work should be. And these mostly men who have these revered status. Carnegie started the National Library System, for goodness sake, but he was a guy who hired goons to beat his employees to prevent them from unionizing. So let's just speak the truth about this. And as Mackinzee so gracefully pointed out, it is a question whether the magnetic force of donative intention by companies and rich people is really the tax break or the good, and acknowledging that there is a lot of really good intention. So let's talk about intention. Money doesn't move out of my pocket to my daughter's bank account without intention. Money is a false reality. It is the intention behind it that informs either the richness or the poverty of the gesture. And one of the problems with American philanthropy, Walt, is that it doesn't have a gesture of uplifting. It has the gesture of maintaining the very colonialistic reality that exists, because the means and mechanisms by which donors and rich philanthropists, with some wonderful exceptions like Dr. Blessman, the means and mechanisms by which they gather their wealth is the immiseration of the very people they in the second half of their lives, because they either get sued, smart, or feel guilty, they're now taking a little bit of the pain away that they caused with their very corporate capitalistic activities. And I'm hyperbolizing to be provocative, to help our listeners and viewers think about these things in a richer way. And I'll close by saying regenerative philanthropy is simple. If a dollar is given with the intention of uplifting the soul, spirit, humanity, and well-being of whoever is the recipient in all of its majesty, then that is a donative intent that we can get behind and that will shift power and build institutions. If it's anything else, it's reinforcing a very, very broken status quo.
Yes, indeed. So you're basically talking about the failure of our social system, our social safety network in part, really how public policy has failed to care for people such that the needs of people are partially addressed by philanthropic gestures and intentions. So what do we do? The people who are controlling, how do we get past this hurdle of having all of the money or so much of the money concentrated in private hands, whose eleemosynary sort of instincts, their generous instincts, are really upended by their desire to make money and to keep the system status quo. How do we open that conversation? Mark, maybe you could speak to it because of the work you're doing with, let's say, Jubilee Justice. I'd love to hear about what that provides as an example, perhaps, of how capital can be, philanthropy can be applied.
So thank you again for giving me a chance to elaborate. So I raised the issue of power and money being connected in ways that may not be constructive for overall society. One of the areas that I have focused a lot of my energies for half of my career is to create context in which money can come into the governance structure of a broader community governed entity. And Potlikker Capital, which is a supporting entity to an entity called Jubilee Justice, is one of those examples. Potlikker Capital focus is to deploy reparative capital, so that's a double entendre on reparations and repairing systems within the Black and Indigenous people of color owned farms in the U.S., primarily in the South, Southeast, and the West Coast. And the issue there is to understand, number one, that the debt is actually owed by society and not this group of folks who've been disenfranchised for centuries, if not decades. In this case, there is a covenant of any donor or any impact investor, if they buy a note or make a grant, that they are absolving themselves of any influence beyond that gift or that investment, and that they are entrusting a community-led, in this case, a majority BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, led board and investment committee to decide the way the committee and the communities need to receive those dollars. And that's the entity that actually allocates the gifts that are provided. So it's a mechanism that is a almost deaccessioning entity between the power that actually generated those resources and perhaps caused much of the harm, to providing resources or reparative capital, investment capital, philanthropic capital, and giving it back to the commons and often the very communities that have been disadvantaged or impaired. it's not a novel concept. I think globally it is novel in the U.S. given the way our financial system has been set up, and certainly the philanthropic structure.
Yeah, when you talk about the commons, I think it certainly brings me back to our topic here on the Public Bank Solution, and that is the role that public banking, banks that are owned by the people, are able to address those people-driven objectives and goals and intentions and needs because they have some power. Right now, of course, as all of us have been illustrating, that power now resides in the hands of a relative few, those people who are rich enough to be able to influence public policy. I think, again, about Carnegie saying, the idea is to share the fruit of the tree, but not the roots. So you can give them a little bit of the produce of the system, but you don't share the principle. In a conversation with Chuck Collins recently, the fellow who gave up his Oscar Mayer fortune wrote the book How Billionaires Spend Millions to Hide Trillions. How that system perpetuates the power that keeps us locked away from having common wealth generated. Dr. Blessman, in your work with children, how has the current state of philanthropy undermined and or benefited the children's frontier horizons?
Well, I am on the board for Children's Advocates for Change. And it is actually an offshoot of another child advocacy group that started in 1987, 34-year-old organization that had incredible history of change and doing some incredible work. A lot of people are very familiar with things like the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is now started as an Illinois initiative, started with this first child advocacy group, and then became part of the national landscape. People are very familiar with all-day Head Start or early preschool or initiatives for providing health care for very young children, home visiting for pregnant moms and or just moms who have just delivered. Those were all the initiatives that were started and amplified in Illinois, and then through the network of child advocacy groups around the nation, then became part of the national landscape. As our agency, over the years, as our agency took on these various initiatives that were cutting edge, paradigm shifting, and certainly elevated the status of children, because we all know what early preschool and Head Start and what long-term implications and impact that's had. As they have started these, sometimes funding would get scarce. And they were sometimes, not enough funding to be able to follow through on the movement for a long period of time. The funding cycles typically are about 3 years, 5 years. We've had maybe one funding source, which is a data-driven source that has gone on since 1992, which I think will continue on. But those have been some of the issues, is that funding gets scarce. Funders are maybe not so sure that they want to go in a certain direction. And so they might pull back funding or not continue to fund or what have you. We recently experienced that as we tried to pass the Racial Impact Note Act, which did pass April 27th at 10:18. It was signed into law. It is one of the most comprehensive racial impact note acts in the country. It's broad-based. It can be applied to any piece of state legislature, requiring that legislation to take a racial equity lens to it and do research to make sure that no disparities are a result of that particular piece of legislation. And there's a data bill that's attached to that. So the money will have to be allocated to do the research to make sure that there are no disequities. So it's a structural solution to a structural problem. But in the process of getting that passed, it was a 5-year effort just to get it passed.
Yeah.
We ran into funding challenges and had to merge with another organization. The merger did not go well. In fact, we're now asking for a divorce and all of that. But that is the problem, is that, and as a result, we now are needing to relaunch and rebirth under a new name as a different organization and seek funding.
Well,
but this time, go ahead.
Let me interrupt just because we only have 2 minutes left.
Right.
And this is just the first part of our conversation. So we're going to rejoin our guests in the second episode. But I wanted to just point out that what we're talking about, and Dr. Blessman was just pointing out the impact on kids. Well, we see how in this COVID era, where the change in public policy to support families with poor families with just $300 more a month has dramatically dropped child poverty. And so here we see again the contrast between the goodwill of some institutional goodwill as expressed through philanthropy and how necessary and valuable that is. But then we also see the importance of creating public policy that is a lasting structural improvement. And again, a way of giving the people the power to be able to determine and how to share the wealth of the community, the common wealth. So there's in our next segment, we're going to be talking about some of these issues, but in a different sort of a framing of what does it mean to regenerate, to create some new possibilities structurally and institutionally. What impact could that potentially have, and what needs to change? I think about Darren Walker at the Ford Foundation. He's getting a lot of play in this program for sure. But he, for example, was talking about not just providing the money to the people on the street, but actually to provide the strength for the institutions that are doing the work. And I think Dr. Blessman was pointing to that, and Mark certainly was as well. When we come back in the next section of the Public Bank Solution, we'll be talking with our guests about reimagining American philanthropy from the standpoint of a regenerative economy and what that whole picture would look like. Thank you very much for being with us in this segment, and we hope you'll join us for the next half. We'll get on with that discussion. Thanks very much.